Big development coming in at this hour. US President Donald Trump has threatened another country in the Caribbean. He has issued yet another warning for Cuba. Taking to his Truth Social platform, Trump said, and I quote him here, "There will be no more oil or money."
And Cuba is ready to fall. But Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it.
Breaking news. Developing now, a decisive shift is unfolding across the Caribbean that few anticipated, but many will feel. In Washington, an abrupt energy decision has been formalized. In Havana, supply calculations are being redrawn in real time, and in Ottawa, quiet preparations are moving faster than expected. What began as a pressure tactic has already set off a chain reaction that is reshaping energy relationships across the Western Hemisphere. On January 11, 2026, the United States confirmed a complete cutoff of oil flows to Cuba tied to Venezuelan supply routes. The announcement was delivered not as a technical adjustment, but as an ultimatum. President Trump stated that no oil and no money would reach Cuba and urged Cuban authorities to make a deal before it was too late.
Cuba is ready to fall. You know? Yes. Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know if they can hold out. But Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. And Cuba literally is ready to fall. And you have a lot of great Cuban Americans that are going to be very happy about this.
The signal was unambiguous. Energy access was now a bargaining instrument, and compliance was the expected outcome. The immediate consequence was not collapse, but acceleration. Venezuelan crude had accounted for roughly 26,000 barrels per day flowing to Cuba, covering a significant share of the island's energy shortfall. That volume disappeared almost overnight following a U.S. military operation in Venezuela earlier in the month that disrupted exports and redirected remaining flows toward American-controlled channels. Power generation schedules in Cuba were revised. Fuel rationing plans were activated. But the response from Havana was not submission. It was diversification. American planners had assumed that removing Venezuelan oil would corner Cuba within weeks. Financial analysts projected rapid deterioration. Political observers predicted that Havana would have no choice but to re-engage Washington on U.S. terms. Those assumptions underestimated two factors that matter more than rhetoric in energy markets: time horizons and alternatives. Within hours of the announcement, Cuban officials publicly reaffirmed their right to import fuel from any supplier willing to export it. Behind the scenes, conversations were already underway in Mexico City and beyond. Mexico confirmed that it had become an important supplier of crude to Cuba, even while emphasizing that overall volumes had not increased dramatically. That distinction mattered. It demonstrated that energy relationships were being recalculated incrementally, not emotionally. This is not the first time a major power has attempted to use energy access to compel political change. The logic is familiar. Control supply, apply pressure, wait for capitulation. What has changed is the environment in which that logic operates. Energy markets today are more fragmented, supply chains more flexible, and middle powers more capable of stepping into gaps created by volatility. For Washington, the cutoff was intended to demonstrate resolve. It also broadcast something else to the region. It showed that contracts and long-standing arrangements could be overridden by executive decision with little notice. For countries watching closely, particularly those dependent on imported energy, that signal carried weight far beyond Cuba. Canada was among those watching, but it was also uniquely positioned to act. For decades, Canadian energy companies have operated in environments defined by long-term contracts, regulatory predictability, and political continuity across administrations. Canada produces more than 5 million barrels of oil per day and exports the majority of that output. The scale is large, but more important is the reputation that accompanies it. Canadian energy exports have remained stable through trade disputes, tariff battles, and shifts in U.S. domestic politics. That track record has become an asset in its own right. As Cuba began reassessing its options, the math was straightforward. Even after Mexican supplies, a gap remained of roughly 13,000 barrels per day. In global terms, that is a modest volume. For large American firms, it barely registers. For Canadian producers accustomed to mid-sized, long-term relationships, it fits squarely within existing capabilities. Infrastructure, refining compatibility, and transportation routes already exist to support such flows, particularly for the heavier crude grades that Cuba's energy system relies on. The contrast between approaches could not be clearer. In Washington, energy access was framed as leverage. In Ottawa, it was framed as commerce. Not charity, not rescue, but a transaction grounded in mutual benefit and reliability. Canadian officials did not issue threats or promises. They did what energy ministries typically do when markets shift. They evaluated capacity, assessed risk, and opened channels of communication. This difference in method carries strategic implications that extend far beyond Cuba. When energy is weaponized, it introduces volatility not only for the target, but for every state that depends on stable supply chains. When energy is treated as a commodity governed by contracts, it reinforces predictability. Over time, states adjust their partnerships accordingly. Intelligence assessments circulating in Washington acknowledge this reality more clearly than public statements suggested. Leaked evaluations described Cuba's situation as strained but not terminal. The loss of Venezuelan support complicated governance and intensified shortages, but it did not eliminate options. Strained is not collapsed. Difficult is not decisive. Those distinctions matter in policy, even if they are inconvenient. As January progressed, the broader pattern became visible. Washington redirected Venezuelan crude toward American refineries under supervised financial arrangements. Mexico provided limited but symbolically important support to Cuba. And Canada emerged as a potential supplier capable of filling the remaining gap without attaching political conditions. None of these moves were dramatic in isolation. Together, they illustrated a shift in how influence is exercised. Middle powers gain leverage not by matching coercion, but by offering alternatives when coercion creates openings. Canada's advantage is not ideological alignment with Havana. It is credibility built over decades of honoring contracts regardless of political disagreement. That credibility lowers perceived risk for partners seeking stability. The message being absorbed across the hemisphere is subtle but powerful. If energy supply can be cut off by a single announcement, then reliance on any one dominant supplier becomes a vulnerability.